Hello, this is Professor Scott Applegate. Welcome to PSCS 6248, Introduction to Cyber Conflict. This is Unit 5, Lesson 1, Non-State Actors in Cyber Conflict. Agenda. In this lesson, we will introduce the topic of non-state actors in cyber conflict. We will then explore a half dozen case studies focused on cyber incidents involving non-state actors. Introduction. We will begin our exploration of non-state actors in cyber conflict during a period of time Jay Healy describes as takeoff. This period is characterized as a period of rapid ascent for cyber conflict, with new organizations being established and new doctrine, policy, and legal structures being created in response to escalating cyber activity. Many of the organizations established during this time frame either still exist today or are the predecessors of today's current organizations. This time frame saw the rise of patriotic hacking, hacktivism, and the use of non-state actors as proxies. Examples of incidents during this time frame include Solar Sunrise, Moonlight Maze, and Web War I. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, we see the rise of patriotic hacking and hacking as a form of activism. Activism focused on many of the same causes that traditional activists tackled, such as human rights violations, political repression, and nuclear tests. Around the turn of the century, so-called patriotic hackers emerged as a distinct subgroup of hacktivists who, rather than hacking for special interest topics, instead engaged in cyber conflict activities on behalf of their nations. Most of these attacks were simple web defacements, denial of service attacks, or the theft and exposure of sensitive information. The evolution of non-state actors participating in cyber conflict has added an additional layer to international relations. States must now look closely at attribution. Some states have taken advantage of the rise of patriotic hackers, utilizing such groups as proxies and further complicating attribution and potential response actions. Historically, the invention of gunpowder is often cited as having broken government's monopoly on the use of violence. Guns made it possible for common citizens with little to no training to engage in political violence, something that in previous centuries had been the reserve of feudal lords who raised trained groups of soldiers. The Internet has similarly broken the tyranny of geography and conflict. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, if an Iraqi wanted to join the fight against the American invasion, he could simply take up arms. If an American wished to join this same fight, he or she would either have to join the military, join one of the commercial security firms providing security details, or find some other way to travel halfway around the world, a very difficult task. With the Internet, however, he and she could join the conflict while remaining at home, attacking online Iraqi institutions and websites with little or no personal risk. Various individuals and groups have begun to exercise this new power, reaching out around the world to virtually join conflicts. Over the last 25 years, there have been many instances of patriotic hacking and participation of non-state actors in cyber conflict. This listing just represents a small portion of the overall activity, ranging from the efforts of 2 or 3 hackers to large-scale efforts across related populations of hackers, each participating individually in a greater campaign. Groups like Anonymous have demonstrated the potential of so-called crowdsourcing, attacks whereby tools and target lists are made freely available to populations likely to participate, and individual users simply download script kiddie tools and join hacking campaigns with little or no advanced skills or knowledge of hacking. As we will see next week, these techniques have also been leveraged by states to conduct non-attributable attacks against competitor states as well. Solar Sunrise. Approximately a year after the eligible receiver red team exercise, an intrusion was detected spanning a number of military, government, and private sector systems. The investigation into this intrusion was codenamed Solar Sunrise. Solar Sunrise took place during the escalating tensions with Iraq shortly before the first Gulf War. While the intrusion was limited to unclassified networks, it is estimated that between 500 and 700 systems were compromised. Initial suspicions pointed towards Iraq as the culprit. The solar sunrise intrusion compromised at least 11 unclassified military systems at the Army, Air Force, and Navy. Additionally, the intrusion compromised systems at NASA, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, MIT, Harvard, University of California at Berkeley, and other universities. It was later discovered that the same intrusion set also compromised systems outside the United States, including computers belonging to the Israeli parliament, Israel's president, and Hamas. The intrusion was originally attributed to Iraq, but this was based entirely on context and circumstantial evidence. The investigations traced the intrusions through an internet gateway in the United Arab Emirates. The UAE was also the primary internet gateway for the country of Iraq. Given this and rising tensions with Iraq, it was assumed they were responsible for the intrusions. On February 1, 1998, the Air Force Computer Emergency Response Team detects an intrusion attempt into systems at Andrews Air Force Base. A root-level compromise is identified by the Air Force's Automated Security Incident Measurement System. Over the next couple weeks, Department of Defense security experts detect additional intrusion attempts on multiple networks across the country, including incidents at Kirkland, Lackland, and Columbus Air Force bases. These intrusions all seem to be coordinated and focused on the current military buildup of forces related to Iraq. These intrusions potentially threaten logistics trains and mobility of forces, and therefore pose a serious threat to the Department of Defense. Methodology. The solar sunrise intrusions exploited a single well-known vulnerability in the 2.4 and 2.6 versions of the Unis Sun Solaris operating system. Hackers only used moderately sophisticated tools, and patches have been available to fix this vulnerability since December of the previous year. The PRC STAT-D subsystem of the operating system was vulnerable to a buffer overflow, which allowed the intruder to gain root access. Once hackers gained access to the system, they installed malware to give them backdoor access to the system and actually patched the vulnerability that had allowed them to gain access to the system in the first place. This prevented other hackers from following the same route into their compromised system. The hackers focused on the exploitation and exfiltration of data. They also collected passwords and other information that might help them to exploit other systems. Attribution. As noted earlier, the intrusions were initially falsely attributed to Iraq due to a traceback through the UAE. The international sourcing of the intrusion, along with suspicions of Iraqi involvement, elevated the intrusions to presidential attention. A joint task force was established to handle the investigation. A civilian internet service provider's operator played a crucial role in the investigation. The ISP operator received complaints that his ISP was being used to conduct attacks against Harvard and MIT, and became aware that his ISP was being used as a launching pad for the intrusions. This information allowed investigators to identify at least one source of the intrusions. As a result, investigators began monitoring the activities of two California teenagers whose screen names were Machiavelli and Stimpy. Additional monitoring of Machiavelli's online conversations revealed a third hacker, an 18-year-old Israeli teenager who goes by the screen name of the Analyzer, who appeared to be teaching Machiavelli in addition to participating in or leading the solar sunrise intrusions. Government response. The Air Force CERT initially attempted to block the attacks, but this resulted in an inadvertent denial of service attack on several commercial internet service providers. Once the teenage hackers were identified in California, investigators began monitoring their internet and telephone lines and remotely installed keyloggers on their computer systems. The investigators continued to monitor their activities in order to gather enough evidence to successfully prosecute the teenagers in court. Due to an unexpected leak of information, the media broke the story that two California teenagers had hacked government systems on February 25th. The government had not expected this disclosure and had to rush to obtain and execute search warrants in order to seize evidence before the suspects could destroy it. The worry was that if the teenagers saw the story on the evening news, they would erase their systems and evidence before the FBI could execute their search warrant. Investigators served the warrant at 6 p.m. on the day the story broke. As law enforcement officials served warrants at each house, the teenagers were online chatting to each other. Both teenagers were interrogated in their homes with their parents present, and investigators seized all their computer equipment intact. The two teenagers admitted their part in the intrusions and provided information to investigators on their Israeli counterpart. A week after the seizures, Analyzer gave an online interview in which he took credit for the intrusions, for mentoring Machiavelli and Stimpy, and conducted a live hacking demonstration. Investigators pooled their resources and were finally able to identify Analyzer as Ehud Yudi Tannenbaum. Tannenbaum eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison in Israel. The two California teenagers also pleaded guilty and were fined, sentenced to 3 years probation and 100 hours of community service. Aftermath. The solar sunrise intrusions confirmed many of the findings of the eligible receiver exercise of the previous year and served as a wake-up call for the Department of Defense. This intrusion demonstrated conclusively that the current structures in place to respond to cyber attacks were unresponsive to the speed of such attacks. Warning processes were inadequate, as were capabilities to detect and assess cyber attacks. Review of the solar sunrise intrusion suggests that 75% of the intrusions could have been prevented with well-trained administrators. The main vulnerability that the solar sunrise intrusions targeted was a well-known flaw with a readily available remedy. As a result of the intrusions, the Department of Defense established the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense, JTF-C&D, to coordinate defenses, set up intrusion detection systems across military networks, and train the department's staff in computer and network defense. JTF-C&D was the first joint warfighting command in the United States military focused on cyber operations. JTF-C&D would reflag several times in the coming years and eventually form the core of United States Cyber Command, a sub-unified combatant command whose commander is also director of the National Security Agency. Solar Sunrise served as a wake-up call that highlighted themes that continue to be central to cyber conflict today. The flawed assumptions that the intrusions originated from Iraq demonstrated the difficulty and need for accurate attribution. The level of cooperation between the FBI, DoD, private internet service providers, and Israeli law enforcement demonstrated the necessity for interagency, public-private, and international cooperation to respond to cyber attacks. This intrusion also demonstrated the problem of lag time between the identification of new vulnerabilities and the patching of those vulnerabilities. Additionally, the need to coordinate and track such patching to ensure it is done in a timely and complete manner across large networks such as those run by the DoD is paramount to preventing the exploitation of such vulnerabilities to breach networks. These themes recur constantly over the last 30 years of cyber conflict. Web War I, Kosovo. The US-led air campaign in Yugoslavia in 1999 is often called Web War I, as it is the first conflict in which there was significant associated activity in cyberspace. During the 78-day air campaign, first-hand reporting by residents of Kosovo spread rapidly across the internet, delivering direct, unfiltered accounts of the cost of war. Patriotic hackers from Yugoslavia, Russia, and the United States also started taking part in the conflict to support their respective nations. Within a few days of the start of the air campaign, NATO and US Navy websites were probed, data erased, and website access was blocked through distributed denial of service attacks. Websites of the FBI and US Senate were inaccessible for more than a week. Hackers completely deleted content from the websites of the US Senate. NATO email servers went down due to massive influxes of Yugo spam. As the air campaign took its toll on the physical communications infrastructure in Belgrade, anti-NATO cyber attacks increasingly came from the Eastern Bloc states. Web activity increased to a new level after the United States accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade on May 7, 1999. Chinese patriotic hackers joined the fight to express their outrage at what Beijing called a barbaric act. For all the fervor patriotic hackers and web reporting caused online, neither proved decisive in any sense. The online activity did not result in any shifts in either public opinion or US policy. These attacks did demonstrate the potential for non-state actors to directly participate in conflict between states. The direct participation and reporting from local citizens also presages events such as the Arab Spring, in which such activity was much more effective. India versus Pakistan. One of the most volatile and worrisome relationships in the realm of cyber conflict is that of India versus Pakistan. The two nations have fought 4 wars since 1947, and there have been numerous border skirmishes and other incidents. There is a high threat of terrorist activities with portions of the Taliban living in Pakistan, and attacks such as the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attack that resulted in more than 100 dead and 600 wounded. Similar problems exist in India, as demonstrated by the recent Lahore terrorist attacks in which 16 were killed and dozens injured by suspected Indian terrorists. The relationship between these states is characterized by high tension and passion on both sides of the border, stoked by ethnic and religious conflict. Both nations also possess nuclear weapons, and both have relatively poor infrastructure and poor cybersecurity practices. There are organized non-state cyber militias on both sides, which have conducted numerous high-profile cyber attacks against their rival governments' websites. Some have accused both states of either using these militias as proxies or turning a blind eye to their activity. This cyber conflict began in August of 2000 with a series of web defacements of Indian websites alleging atrocities committed by the Indian military in Kashmir. Pakistani patriotic hackers are often organized into structured cyber militias and have conducted numerous intrusions and defacements. Indian patriotic hackers have retaliated in kind. Pakistani groups have tended to be more active and organized than their Indian counterparts, partially due to the Indian government's attempt to limit retaliation. Although the Indian government has attempted to limit retaliation, attacks have still persisted, and few, if any, prosecutions have taken place against those conducting such attacks against Pakistan. Pakistan, for its part, has turned a blind eye to all such activity by its patriotic hackers. While Healy's book discusses events from 1999 to 2000, this conflict has been active and ongoing ever since, with numerous groups on either side participating in substantial attacks. Since the year 2000, these groups have continued to evolve in sophistication. Groups such as the ICA, PCA, and PCF have embraced social media for recruitment and messaging, making use of Facebook pages, websites, and Twitter feeds. We will discuss some of these groups over the next few slides. The Indian Cyber Army is one of the most visible groups operating out of India. The ICA publicly portrays an image of themselves as cybersecurity professionals attempting to have a positive impact. They have a website for recruiting and make heavy use of social media with Facebook and Twitter sites to message their followers. They sponsor training and certification for members and publish security articles as well. Contrary to their public image, members of the group have participated in some very high-profile cyber attacks, such as in 2010, when they hacked more than 36 Pakistani government websites to conduct web defacements. Pakistan's counterpart to the Indian Cyber Army is the Pakistan Cyber Army. Like its Indian counterpart, the Pakistan Cyber Army bills itself as a professional organization, stating, "We are not hackers, we are security lovers." But also like its counterpart, its members have participated in numerous high-profile attacks and intrusions against Indian websites. One of the more notable was a defacement of the website for the Indian Central Bureau of Investigation, India's equivalent to the FBI. The PCA also has its own website and makes strong use of social media such as Twitter and Facebook for recruiting and messaging. Each time either the ICA or the PCA carry out successful attacks, their counterpart attempts to retaliate in kind, often with a more spectacular result. The Pakistan Cyber Force is similar to the PCA in most respects. It is a volunteer group which has its own website, Twitter account, and Facebook page, and like other groups, claims to represent security professionals. One difference between the PCA and the PCF is the PCF occasionally targets other Western nations rather than simply focusing on India. While this conflict appears limited to the cyber domain and has thus far been mostly harmless in terms of relations between these two states, what makes it worrisome is the combination of immature infrastructure, inflamed passions, and the tendencies for these groups to constantly try to one-up each other. The groups involved have substantial numbers of volunteers participating, and many are very skilled. The potential for spillover into kinetic conflict between these two states is very real given the animosity between the two governments and the occasional accusations by each government that their counterpart is allowing or sponsoring the cyber attacks. Hainan Island Incident. In April of 2001, a U.S. Navy EP-3 intelligence aircraft collided with a Chinese J-811 fighter off the southern coast of China. Chinese patriotic hackers lashed out against American systems. Groups such as the Honker Union of China disseminated hacking tools and target lists on popular Chinese web portals. U.S. hackers responded in kind, launching a tit-for-tat battle of web defacements. This cyber conflict ultimately lasted much longer than the diplomatic crisis, with new attacks occurring months after the two nation-states had come to a resolution of the original incident. The Hainan Island incident did demonstrate the potential of non-state groups to join and potentially escalate an international incident. In this case, the actions of the hackers had no real impact on the negotiations between China and the United States. Syrian Electronic Army. The Syrian Electronic Army first gained public notice in April of 2011 when it launched a series of web defacements on Facebook. Shortly thereafter, the SEA launched its own web page. The SEA's main goal appears to be to get Western countries to change their policies and public perception of the emerging conflict in Syria. They did this mainly by bombarding and defacing Western targets with pro-Assad propaganda. The Syrian Electronic Army is a pro-Ba'athist, pro-Bashar al-Assad hacktivist group that appears to have no direct ties to the Syrian government. Indeed, Bashar al-Assad himself has publicly confirmed that this group has no ties to his regime, while at the same time praising their efforts. U.S. intelligence agencies believe the group may be Iranian in origin rather than Syrian. The group is most well known for hijacking the Twitter feeds of the New York Times, the Washington Post, Forbes, and The Guardian. On April 23, 2013, the SEA achieved its most successful attack to date when it hijacked the Associated Press's Twitter feed. What made the attack stand out was not the compromising of the account, but rather the use of the account to release a false and explosive story to the public, claiming the White House had come under attack and that the president had been wounded. Within seconds of the release, stock prices plummeted more than 100 points on investor fears, resulting in a temporary $136 billion swing in the market. The market corrected itself within 5 minutes, but the attack definitely demonstrated the potential to affect financial markets worldwide with a fairly simplistic hack. AP reacted by temporarily shutting down its Twitter feed. In another high-profile cyber attack, the SEA managed to poison DNS records and redirect the websites of the New York Times and the British version of the Huffington Post. Users browsing these websites were instead presented with pro-Assad, anti-Western propaganda. This proved a minor annoyance to some readers and caused a stir among the paper's security staffs, but otherwise had little effect. The Syrian Electronic Army is a reactionary group supportive of the Assad regime, which only acts in response to Western provocations. In recent years, the United States has identified and unsealed indictments against several of its members. While the U.S. is obviously unable to prosecute, the threat of apprehension and extradition is enough to force those indicted individuals to refrain from travel to any country that has extradition treaties with the United States. The SEA's actions have been largely inconsequential, failing to change either U.S. policies or public perception of the Assad regime. Cyber Gaza. In 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings were thought to be the turning point against authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. The Middle East and North Africa were filled with grassroots and spontaneous demonstrations, often fueled by social media campaigns. By 2012, the movement had largely lost momentum, with governments throughout the Middle East clamping down violently on protesters and popular uprisings in Egypt, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, amongst others. In November of 2012, Israel ramped up its military campaign and naval blockade of the Gaza Strip, focusing most of its efforts towards Hamas. The anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian cyber community, and others throughout the Middle East quickly responded with a series of cyber attacks and web defacements. There was hope that these cyber campaigns would be a continuation of the physical protests of the year before and would galvanize world opinion in support of the Palestinian cause. In June of 2008, Egypt brokered a deal between Hamas and Israel to stop rocket attacks into Israel. The rocket attacks continued unabated after the deal. In November of 2012, Hamas's head of military operations was killed by a targeted Israeli airstrike. Israel used social media to broadcast video of the strikes to showcase precision and avoidance of collateral damage. Hamas responded by tweeting photos of numerous dead children purportedly killed by the Israeli airstrikes. Israel threatened to cut off electricity and internet access to the Gaza in response to these posts. The conflict escalated beyond social media, and hacktivist groups began a series of cyber incidents in retaliation to Israel's campaign in the Gaza. The initial wave of cyber activity was largely prevented by Israeli government and private sector cybersecurity personnel, with the exception of intrusions into the Israeli-Philippine embassy website and the systems of an Israeli private defense contractor. A second wave, launched by the group Anonymous, succeeded in defacement and shutdown of various networks, including Bank of Jerusalem. Some Israeli.gov websites went down the weekend of December 8, 2012, but were restored by the following Monday. Over 663 Israeli websites were defaced, 87 pages were deleted, and thousands of stolen passwords were exposed. Additionally, the Facebook and Twitter feeds of the Vice Prime Minister of Israel were defaced. Thereafter, the impact on targets in Israel was minimal. Anonymous and other hacktivist groups launched a series of cyber operations in support of the Palestinian cause and other Middle Eastern clampdowns. These included Op Gaza, Op Israel, Op Syria, and Op Egypt. While the Cyber Gaza conflict added a new domain to the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine, it does not seem to have fundamentally changed or impacted the relations between the states involved. Other groups, such as the Iranian Cyber Army, have joined the battle for influence, respect, and position in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, but the foreign policy dynamics have not changed with the spread of the dispute to cyberspace. While the Cyber Gaza campaign was impressive in terms of both scope and scale, it had minimal effect on the Israeli government. The majority of attempted intrusions were blocked or quickly remediated by the Israeli government and private sector cybersecurity personnel, and the campaign had no appreciable effect on Israel's campaign in Gaza. Eventually, the violence was stopped due to a peace deal brokered by the United States, the United Nations, and Egypt. Conclusions. The Internet has broken the tyranny of geography in regards to participation in conflicts, allowing individuals to virtually join the fight for causes they want to support anywhere in the world. While attacks and malicious activity by hacktivists and patriotic hackers have increased over the last decade, the severity of such attacks remains low. Most incidents consist of web defacements, denial of service attacks, or releasing compromising or embarrassing information. Thus far, the participation of non-state actors in cyber conflicts has not been decisive in the context of international relations. If intrusions by non-state actors remain low-level, low-impact events, states will likely continue to largely ignore such efforts, even from within their own borders. If more disruptive technologies diffuse from states to non-state actors, this could significantly alter the impact of such events and greatly empower non-state actors. This threat may partially account for the restraints states have exercised in relation to the use of disruptive cyber weapons. This is Professor Scott Applegate. I hope you enjoyed this lesson on non-state actors in the history of cyber conflict. Please feel free to contact me if you have any specific questions in regards to this lecture.